following program is made possible in part by the Dayton Bar Association.
Good evening and welcome to You and the Law. My name is Jeff Swillenger. I'm your host this evening, and I'm very pleased to have as my guest this evening a very dear friend of mine, Judge Mary Donovan of the 2nd District Court of Appeals, seated primarily here in Dayton, Ohio. Mary and I have been friends for many, many years, and we'll get into that in a little bit. First, I just want to remind you that if you found us and you're watching tonight, we're on DATV, that's Dayton Access Television. The phone number here is 937-223-5311. The show is streaming live. If you're in the southern suburbs, traditionally you're not going to get us live, but Miami Valley Cable Council does show us at some later date. Now, I don't want to spend too much time talking tonight about all of that. This is a solemn evening. Mike Monta, the longtime host of this show for over 27 years, and gentleman who turned over the baton to me about 5 years ago, passed away this past Thursday. He was a dear friend of Judge Donovan and your host, and a lot of other good people in this town. Mike was a wonderful lawyer, husband, father, grandfather, wonderful in all those categories. I only regret I didn't know him longer and better. He was a trial lawyer in the federal courts, the state courts in and around Montgomery County, both at the common pleas and municipal court level, in addition to his very outstanding work as a criminal defense lawyer in some very tough cases over the years. Mike had a general practice, and by all accounts was one of Dayton's finest for many, many years. Judge, you'd like to share a few thoughts about Mike. I believe you were on his show years ago when he was the host. Years ago, 5 years ago was his last show. But I don't recall when you were on. I will say one thing before I ask you to reflect specifically on that is, it looks as though our December show is going to be a repeat of my interview of Mike from 2018 or 2019. I interviewed him. It was an evening with Mike Monta to talk about his years at DATV, hosting this show, and also his career. It was really a wonderful evening, not due to anything I did. I stepped back and let Mike do most of the talking, and he kind of gave us a nice retrospective on his career. And so what we're going to do is we're going to repeat that on December 5th, which is our next show. So with that in mind, Judge, why don't we talk about Mike a little bit, and then we'll get into talking about you, because the topic for tonight is an evening with Judge Mary Donovan, from public defender to this Court of Appeals. So again, good evening. I'll probably find myself saying Mary, I'll find myself saying Judge, but welcome.
Mary's fine, and I met Mike. What a tremendous loss to the legal community. I met him when we were in law school, actually. I was not in law school with him, I was in law school with his lovely wife, Vaso, who was at the top of our class. And Mike was one of those private lawyers that did a great deal of criminal defense work and garnered a reputation as just a bright star, intelligent man with a great sense of wit. And he often would ask public defenders, prosecutors, trial judges to be on his show. So I was on his show, You and the Law, several times as a younger lawyer and as a trial judge. And I think he may have actually convinced me to also appear as an appellate judge after 2005. But just a very bright man, witty man, wrote many lampoon articles for the Dayton Bar Brief. So it's a tremendous loss to the legal community.
Yeah, I second all of that. For those who go online or receive the Dayton Daily News, I believe his obituary will be out maybe in print this week. I believe it went online this afternoon. And you'll learn a little bit more about Mike and his distinguished career and his love for and his family's love of him. And I know that his signature was to sign off all these years, all the years that he did the show by saying goodnight to his grandchildren. And we talked about some of that in that interview that I did with him that we're going to do again and repeat and show that in December. So with that in mind, Mike, we'll miss you, and may your passing be for a blessing and for a memory. Judge, let's talk about you. Like I said, we've been old friends, or are old friends, and we've been friends for over 40 years. You grew up in Cincinnati. I grew up in Cincinnati. We didn't know one another until years later, but why don't you tell us a little bit about growing up in Cincinnati and how it is that you made your way to Dayton, and I'll just sit back and listen.
Well, I'm a few years older than you, and I grew up in the west side of Cincinnati, and you grew up, in the north central side?
Yes.
I went to Seton High School, which is a parochial high school on the west side of town near Elder High School. It's a football powerhouse. Mm-hmm. I often told people, I remember when Pete Rose, who attended West High, when I was a kid, we could walk to West High. When he signed his first major league contract, he came with his brand new red Corvette through the Frisch's drive-through when you could pull up and order at the radio. And so I grew up in that side of town, attended the University of Cincinnati, and came to the University of Dayton School of Law, graduating in 1977. It was the first class since World War II. They had closed the law school during wartime, and they reopened it in 1974.
So you mentioned that Mike's wife, Vaso, was in your class, and there were other lawyers who were in your class, or other students who became attorneys and practiced and have had successful careers in and outside of Dayton, I know, over the years. And as we talk this evening, if you want to mention anyone and bring them into any stories you tell, or maybe those that have some story that you want to tell about them, feel free to do so.
A name that would be known to the community is the late Judge A.J. Wagner. He was a classmate of mine, and we bonded in that he was one of 18 children. I am one of 10 children, so we were friends during law school. And Judge Barbara Gorman, along with Vaso Monta, they were at the top of our class. Dahl McGranjean, a local lawyer. Many of the women were at the top of the class. There's several still here in town from my class. Mike Conway, who's in private practice, Marty Malloy. Those are a few names that come to mind almost instantly.
Know all those folks, fine lawyers and judges, some of them. Those who are judges are fine judges.
True.
Not all of them were judges. Make sure I clarify that. That's great. That's great. So what did you do when you got out of law school?
I practiced very briefly in Cincinnati with a gentleman down there, really just doing research and writing. I was looking for a job, and I landed a job in Lake County, which is Painesville, Ohio, as a public defender. I was very fortunate there in that a juvenile court judge Judge Richard Hoos, who was the father of 7, took me under his wing because there really weren't any women doing criminal defense work back then, private or public. There was a female on the bench in Lake County, but I was the sole female criminal defense lawyer at that time. Small town, it was nice to practice in a small town because the Bar Association was very friendly, and as I said, a judge took me under his wing. I think he had high expectations for his sons as well as his daughters, so he was very kind and gracious to me. I practiced up there for about a year. It was tough practice in that it's snow belt, and we rode circuit around the county.
This is up along Lake Erie.
Correct, east of Cleveland, yes, near Ashtabula. And, but it was fun. I work with all men, which has been true of most of my career. I mean, even now in the Court of Appeals, I'm the first woman elected to the 2nd District Court of Appeals. When I was on the trial bench, there was already a female on the trial bench, Judge Barbara Gorman.
So you spent a year at the Lake County Public Defender's Office.
Correct.
And then what brought you down here?
Just had an opportunity to get back closer to home. I had a lot of family still living in Cincinnati, and so there was an opportunity at the Dayton Public Defender's Office. I had interned there when I was in law school, so I applied and obtained the job.
Okay. Now, that would have been roughly late 1978, early
1979.
79, okay. Because I know it was October 79 when we met, and you were my mentor and partner when I got to the office.
Yeah, I think you tried your first case with me as your second chair,
Yes.
or vice versa. I
Or
forget.
just sitting there, I think pulling me on the back of my coat to sit down when I needed to sit down, and when I got a little too rambunctious. But yeah, my first jury trial, you were right there. Absolutely. Yeah, this is your night, so we're not going to get into the details of that. Needless to say, it was a conviction, but we have reminisced about that trial many times. So tell me what it was like being in Dayton at that time and practicing criminal defense. It was the late 70s, and what was going on in Dayton as it impacted on the types of clients we had and the types of cases we had come through the door.
Well, it was before the onslaught of cocaine, crack cocaine, powder cocaine. So many of our indigent clients that had addictions, it was more likely to be a heroin or an alcohol addiction.
Toluene, huffing.
Oh, sniffing, yes. Back then we would represent any number of individuals that would sniff paint to get high. It was high volume. Whether you prosecuted or defended, it was high volume in municipal courts and common police courts, a lot of trials, criminal trials. And once again, getting back to being kind of that minority, when I first came to town, the only female on the bench was in domestic relations court, and she later went to juvenile court. Her name, Judge Lillian Kern. Mm-hmm. Interesting thing about her that people would find surprising today is because everyone was so accustomed to male advocates, she wanted females who appeared in front of her to wear a tie or some type of bow. And I remember telling my boss that I didn't own a blouse with a bow or I didn't own a tie, and I didn't intend to go out and buy one. And he said, well, you're going to have to get one to appear in front of her. And I said, if she wants me to wear a bow tie,
Your audio is still too loud.
then she can buy it for me. And I did appear in front of her, but I did so without a bow or a tie. So, but that was her reputation. She was considered a bright judge, a tough judge. And then later, Judge Alice McCullum, who we all know as a former municipal court judge and longtime probate judge, came on to the municipal court bench. But once again, it was one of the gentlemen who kind of took me under his wing, Judge Jack Duncan, who happened to be from Kentucky, and I was born in Louisville, Kentucky. So I always kind of had somebody looking out for me. And of course, Judge McCullum treated me very well, as did many of the judges, because there weren't still that many women doing criminal defense. And I can remember at times as a young lawyer sparring with Angela Fryman, who was a very good prosecutor. And we were kind of a novelty to have two women advocates at the same time on a criminal matter, she prosecuting, me defending. And that's changed. Now we have a plethora. We have a lot of women in the public defender's office or the prosecutor's office, or a lot more women that are partners or litigators in private firms as well.
And magistrates and judges.
True.
At all levels of the court.
Right.
Okay. Any particular cases you want to talk about from back in those days? Anything that was particularly memorable? Any of the people that you worked with in the public defender's office? I hesitate to offer any names, but we worked there, at least as long as I was there. I think I left and you were there, and then you left and later came back. But tell me, anyone you want to share stories about there?
Well, an interesting one, if I back up all the way to the late 70s when I was still a Lake County public defender, I defended a man who was accused of assaulting a deputy sheriff. And that deputy sheriff later went on to become a trial judge. In fact, he's currently running for the 11th District Court of Appeals. But at the time, he was a complaining witness on a felonious assault. And back at that time, our client was facing 8 to 15 years in prison for felonious assault. And we had a week-long jury trial in front of Judge Mitrovich, who was really a tough but smart judge up in the Lake County area. And the jury came back with a not guilty verdict. And the prosecutor asked that the jury be polled. It's not uncommon for the state or the defense to ask for jury polling at the end of a criminal case. And normally the polling results in an affirmation of the verdict. But what happened is they went through the 12 jurors. The 12th one said, "That's not my verdict." And a mistrial was declared. And the defendant had to stand trial again. Now, I wasn't there. I left to go to Dayton. And on the second time, he was convicted.
Now, over the years, have you run into the judge and had occasion to talk about that case over the years?
More often, if I'm serving on a committee and he's a member of the committee, I might bring up the fact. And I think he thinks that the first jury obviously got it wrong and the second jury got it right.
Sure.
There was a change of counsel with the second jury, and maybe the state was better prepared the second time.
Yeah. Okay. I don't remember that. I don't know of all the stories we've shared over the years.
That's before you started in the public defender's
Yeah,
office,
yeah.
and it was when I was in a different jurisdiction.
Yeah. Want to talk about any other cases or any of the colleagues in the office, judges such as Carl Kessler or anyone else? Bob Brown, I know someone that
Well, Bob
you
Brown was
thought
actually my
highly of.
mentor judge when I
Yeah.
became a trial judge, and but Carl Kessler was a force of nature. He was the presiding judge for many years in Montgomery County. In fact, his robe is enshrined on the first floor of the courthouse under glass. He kind of ruled things with an iron fist. He was a smart man, but a bit of a character. He'd do any number of things to embarrass you. But we had a good relationship, and I had the nickname Mad Dog, of all things. Has nothing to do with my personality or my drinking habits, but back then many clients would get high on Mogan David 2020 Mad Dog wine, and so it kind of became my moniker because we would sign memos by our initials. So people started calling me Mad Dog.
MD.
Yeah, and
MD 2020.
it was great when I was at Central Raymond's and the presiding judge would address me as Mad Dog. My clients sitting in the jury box would sit up in their chairs thinking, wow, I've got a tenacious lawyer. So it was a nice moniker to have. But there's still a few people in the legal community that get away with calling me that on occasion.
Judge Mad Dog.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, they don't call me Judge Mad Dog. They still call me Mad Dog.
Okay. What was it like being a public defender and not a private practice attorney in terms of how you were treated by your clients, by their families, fellow lawyers, the judges? Was there something unique about being a public defender at that time that you recall?
Well, you would occasionally get the client that said, I want to go out and hire a real attorney. Mm-hmm. And I was very blessed. That didn't happen to me because I think that I know that preparation is the key. A relationship with your client is the key. So I attempted from the beginning to build good relationships with my clients, make it evident to them that I was an advocate, that I was every bit as good as the guy that they might have to pay $10,000 to. Because public defenders are real lawyers, as are prosecutors. They're public servants in different ways. Obviously, the state represents victims of crime. The defendants, public defenders, represent individuals who are too poor or indigent. They cannot afford private counsel. And many of them are some of the finest lawyers in town. Some of the prosecutors are some of the finest lawyers in town. Many in those trial capacities go on to become judges. But you're always up against the thought process of some that you get what you pay for, and if you're not paying for it, maybe you're getting an inferior product. But I think in Montgomery County, we have very talented public defenders. We have many talented prosecutors as well.
Okay. So how long did you do that before you left the office?
I believe it was a decade. And then I did take a sabbatical and worked at a Navajo and Apache reservation out west for a year.
Okay. Now, I think we've talked about this before a number of times, and I think I mentioned we wouldn't go too deep in that tonight because of the time limitations, but I wanted to clarify something. You were not doing tribal law while you were there. You were not licensed to practice out there, and you were not trained in the ways of the tribal court, whatever that might require, as I recall. But why don't you tell us briefly what you were doing on the reservation?
Well, I wasn't actually on the reservation. Portions of New Mexico, Arizona are what we call checkerboard area. So you may have reservation in one square mile, and the next square mile is private U.S. territory, if you will. I mean, non-reservation. So they call the non-reservation area checkerboard because you might be surrounded by a portion of a Navajo reservation or Apache reservation, but you're on a piece of land that is regular U.S. territory. Okay. So, but I was at a Catholic mission, and although I did not practice law because I was not licensed in New Mexico, I did not practice tribal law because I was not on the reservation, which is a whole different spectrum of law. I did assist the mission in some questions that they had about water rights. As probably everybody knows, New Mexico, Arizona can be pretty dry, and that's can be a very pressing issue. But most of the time, I was a stay-at-home kind of mom to 12 Navajo and Apache children who lived on the reservation, so it was impossible for them to go to and from the reservation, so they actually lived at the school. And at the same time I was their substitute mother, I was occasionally driving a school bus. I taught physics, tried to. I was staying a page or two ahead of the kids. I wasn't particularly good at physics, and occasionally filled in to teach Spanish.
Okay. And didn't you major in Spanish?
I did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. In fact, back in the day, before we had all the certified interpreters, I would receive a call periodically to go to court to interpret for someone who was not English speaking. And that was a challenge at times because of the different in dialects, if you will.
That was when you were back here in Montgomery County.
True, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you were out there for approximately a year?
Yes, that's
and
true.
And then did you come back to Dayton or Cincinnati? I can't recall.
I returned to Cincinnati, my hometown, worked for the city prosecutor's office down there. My brother was a career prosecutor, so I had the privilege to work with him, which was fun. But I got a little bored. It was easy to prosecute in municipal court in Cincinnati. So I kind of yearned for doing defense work again or going into the private sector. So I came back to Dayton to do both of those things.
Okay. So how long were you in Cincinnati?
A year.
Okay. Then you came back to the private practice or the public defender's office?
Public defender's office for a bit.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And then went into private practice at the firm of Albury, Cross, Fogarty, and Tuss.
Okay. And it's there you practice with, amongst others, Mark Tuss.
Mark Tuss, Charles Albury, Kevin Fogarty, and the late Jim Cross.
Jim Cross.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And was Mr. Pop there at any point
Yes,
with you?
I'm sorry, I forgot Vince Pop.
Yeah.
Sorry, Vince, if you're watching. Yeah, Vince had come from the city prosecutor's office, as had Mark Tuss, so I knew them from litigation. Charles Albury, I believe I knew from the law school, so Vince as well.
I didn't mean to embarrass you, but I thought because I practiced the public defender's office, and when Vince was a prosecuting attorney, and we had our cases, and I had cases where Mark Tuss, before he went into private practice, was a prosecuting attorney. So I had thought that that's where you met them, but
I
they
should have
became your
mentioned Vince when I
Yeah.
talked about law school, as well as your dear friend Larry Lasky,
Yeah.
who many in the legal community know, both of them, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then that's the whole nother story in terms of how they knew one another and their spouses knew one another and so forth. We talked, but again, we'll move on from that tonight. So you came back to the PD's office, then you went into private practice, and how long were you in private practice? And you were doing what, mostly civil work at that point in private practice?
I was doing civil as well as criminals,
Okay.
a little bit of probate, a little bit of domestic relations work. I have a great deal of respect for attorneys that do domestic relations work. It was not my cup of tea. I think it's very challenging, but I did a little bit of that.
Okay.
And then in June of 1995, I was appointed by then Governor Voinovich to the Common Pleas Court General Division Bench.
Okay. 1995. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So then for the next, 17 years?
Next 10 years. I was
10
a
years.
Common Pleas Court judge, General Division judge for a decade, as well as the drug court judge, which was an additional responsibility.
Why don't you talk about that? And
About drug court?
About your tenure. I'm sorry, I just had the number of years incorrect, but let's focus on what you did, not the number of years.
Well, the trial court is really the battlefield. Its volume can be very high. You can be working on a murder case one moment, and the next minute you've been assigned a request for a preliminary injunction on a complex civil matter, and the next week maybe you're starting a personal injury or medical malpractice case. So it's juggling a lot of balls at one time. It's where the rubber hits the road, the trial court. I really enjoyed jury trials. In fact, I was reading some questionnaires from jurors back from 2006 maybe. So how many years? 16 years ago, because I was cleaning out my office. And it's really refreshing to see ordinary citizens that once they've served on a jury, you know, they find it interesting, or they were treated with such dignity and respect, they want to come back and do it again. So I can't overemphasize the importance of jury duty. And many citizens are willing to sacrifice their time and energy and talent and listen to a case, because, you know, a month from now it could be their case if, you know, they've been in an automobile accident, or somebody's broken into their home, or their business partner runs off with the assets. So jury duty is really important. So I'd urge citizens, when you get the summons, please report.
Well, let's talk about jury duty for a moment. Do you remember the first jury you had as a trial judge, and And if you talk a little bit about your approach to the selection of jurors, some judges are very actively involved in the selection. Some judges sit back and let the lawyers do most of the questioning. What was your first trial like, and how did you approach it over the years on the bench?
Well, my very first trial, I know that Larry Lasky was on that very first trial. It was a landlord-tenant case that was tried in common pleas court rather than municipal court, which is unusual. I don't recall the reasons why. It's been so many years ago. And I don't recall.
That's not a loaded question, because Mr. Lasky, because I could have asked whether he was counsel or one of the parties.
Yes, he wasn't the defendant. He was defense counsel. I don't recall who plaintiff's counsel was.
Let that record reflect that I'm
Yes.
not the one who brought that up.
Yes, but Mr. Lasky, I remember, won that case. I don't remember the particulars of it other than a bathtub had overflowed and there was damage to apartments below and above, and but I don't remember it with particularity now. It's been over
Okay.
close to 28 years ago.
Okay. Well, I didn't prepare you for that question.
Right.
What about your approach to selecting jurors? I think that's an interesting question. So many people see the law through the eyes of the directors who direct TV shows and movies, and the experts that I presume they use to help them do that. But what's it like in real life when the jury's being selected, and what's in terms of the role of the judge, and how you viewed that?
Well, there's certainly a certain amount of gravitas, a certain amount of decorum when you enter a common pleas court, general division court for jury duty. It could be a murder case, it could be a robbery, it could be a rape, it could be a multi-million-dollar civil case. So the judge has to control the courtroom, has to be aware of the law, the rules of evidence, manage that courtroom, be respectful of the juror's time, be respectful of the attorney's time. In terms of seating a jury, it's voir dire, which means to speak the truth. We refer to it as voir dire because if you're sworn in as a juror, you're expected to tell the truth about any bias or prejudices you may have, or complications you may have. But when it comes to selecting the jury, most judges only ask a few questions, provide the jury with basic information, allow the attorneys to try their case. Mm-hmm. And part of that is selecting the jury.
Okay. Did you have many jury trials?
When I was a trial judge, yes. That was back at a time when there were a lot more cases going to trial and going to jury trial. Now there are more civil cases that have been impacted by tort reform, arbitration, mediation, cost-saving measures. Arbitration and mediation can be cost-saving measures. So they're not the same level of civil jury trials now as there was back in 1995. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk about any of these jury trials you had? Any that you have of which you have a particular memory, for some reason, a unique set of facts? Someone who was charged with a crime and burst out and yelled, "I did it! I did it!"
Those Perry Mason moments don't happen in real life.
They don't?
No, in fact,
Okay.
many attorneys during voir dire or during their opening statement will say, this is not like TV. It's not like all the shows you see on television. It's mm-hmm. pretty, maybe, I don't want to say boring, but compared to a television show, some might characterize it as boring.
Yeah. Now, those are the less serious cases, of course. I know you would not be bored by some of the more serious felonies that you had to try, and I know that those require a lot greater intensity of attention. And I before I retired, I actually got to sit on an aggravated vehicular homicide jury, as you know. And this, again, is not about me tonight, but it was an incredible experience. and the jurors took their duty very seriously, and I was very proud to be a part of that jury, in part because of the character of the people that I sat with that week. But when you have a really tough trial where there's a lot of emotion, anything unique about that? Anything you did differently from the bench? Were there any cases that called for you to, that required special circumstances, even if it was security, something unusual? Anything you can think of?
Well, in many of the criminal cases, obviously we would have security perhaps from the get-go because the accused is in custody, so there would always be a deputy present for that purpose. If it's a horrible case, horrible facts, families that are at each other's throats because someone has been molested or someone has died, you may ask for extra security to make sure that those quote-unquote warring fractions don't get into it with one another in the gallery, because you're obviously concerned about the jurors' safety, the safety of court staff, the safety of the witnesses, safety of the attorneys.
Ever have any cases where you had to take the attorneys to sidebar and possibly admonish them or tell them they were getting close to being admonished because of their behavior in the court in the course of a trial? Either, no names, but just.
Oh no, I wouldn't use any names.
If we did this in 3 months after you were off the bench and retired, I'll ask you that question again with names. But no, seriously, did you ever have to admonish the attorneys or warn them they were getting a little too close to the line?
I had a very serious wrongful death case where a deviation from the standard of care had been admitted by the defendant doctor in the hospital, and one of the attorneys was disregarding all my admonitions, and I at one point in time in chambers said that his behavior was abominable, like the abominable snowman. I remember looking that word up, I'm probably mispronouncing it. Abominable.
Yeah.
And it was just deplorable. I didn't want to hold him in contempt. I didn't have to, but there were several other attorneys in the room, and yeah, that was a challenging case. But he was strong-willed and felt that his client deserved more money than what was being offered. So his approach was at times a little overzealous.
Controlling the courtroom is an important aspect of being a trial judge, isn't it?
Correct.
Yeah, the judges, the jury, the witnesses, they're following a certain decorum in order for the case to be able to proceed appropriately to some finality, right?
Especially in a common pleas court when you're dealing with complex criminal and civil matters. In municipal court, oftentimes people, Judge Jack Duncan, he referred to it as the people's court. You have individuals that are there for a speeding ticket or no license or petty theft, and it's a bit more laid back, if you will.
In municipal court.
True.
Of course, sometimes the volume of cases changes the temperature in the
Atmosphere,
courtroom,
yes.
in the courtroom too. And then some of the judges, like Judge Duncan, who I liked, although I was, he never failed to amaze me about some things he said and he did. But he was very good to me, and the first judge I appeared before in the municipal court on whose docket I appeared, along with you, and his court reporter at the time, now Nancy Brookshire, then Nancy Trimble. She was like the shadow judge who taught me a few things too about how to conduct myself as a lawyer.
Oh, I think the advice for lawyers is do not overestimate the necessity of developing an excellent relationship with court personnel,
Sure.
whether it's a stenographic reporter or now the judicial assistants that run audio equipment or the bailiff, because everything you say or do gets back to the judge. So use the same degree of politeness and respect to support staff as well.
Yeah, That's a very good point. At any level of the courthouse, right?
True.
So you did this for how many years now? Back to years?
A trial judge for a decade, and now an appellate judge for 18
Okay.
years. So when I retire in January, and it's mandatory retirement in Ohio, you can't run after you've turned 70, and I'll be 72 this month, so I'm not eligible to run for re-election.
Okay.
So total of 28 years on the bench.
Okay. My question wasn't as focused as it should have been. I didn't want to quite get to the end of your career yet there. I wanted to, after your tenure on the trial bench, how is it that you went to the Court of Appeals and talk about that service and what you've been doing? And you might even tell us a little bit for the viewers as to what the Court of Appeals does. While you may sit most of the time here in Montgomery County, the number of counties over which you have jurisdiction, and how you may travel to the other counties in the course of a year and hear cases, and not just remain in Montgomery County during the course of your daily activities. You want to talk about that a little bit? So how is it that you first made your way to the Court of Appeals?
Well, I ran for an open seat. Judge Fred Young was like me now currently. He was over 70 and could not run again, so there was an open seat.
He was a fine man.
Yes, and I ran for his seat in 6 counties. The 2nd District Court of Appeals, our main office is in Dayton, Ohio, but we also serve Miami County, Greene County, Darke County, Clark County, and Champaign County. So I campaigned in all 6 counties and won election a total of 3 times.
Okay.
And for the viewer that's not real familiar with the levels of court, we've been talking about municipal court, which you might think of as step 1. They handle lower level civil matters, misdemeanors. Common police court, general division, probate, DR, juvenile. And then a step above that is the Court of Appeals. And then the 4th step would be the Ohio Supreme Court.
Okay. So the level at which you are now practicing as a judge is the level one step lower than the Ohio Supreme Court. You mentioned the jurisdictions that your court covers. Why don't you tell the public you're in the 2nd District, how many districts there are, and a little bit about what you do as a Court of Appeals judge.
There are a total of 12 districts.
Throughout Ohio.
Correct. Many of the districts, like ours, are multiple counties. The exception would be the 1st District, Hamilton County, the 10th District, Franklin County, the 8th District, Cuyahoga County. The other districts have multiple county jurisdiction.
Okay.
And it's very different than the trial court in that we do not conduct jury trials. We are an error correcting court. So all those lower...
Spell that word. It's
error.
not A-I-R.
Error. E-R-R-O-R.
The error, there was an error of potential confusion, I thought there, so I thought I'd have you explain
Judge
that.
Fain always said we are an error, E-R-R-O-R,
Yeah.
correcting court.
Yeah, yes. And you also have, I know that it was Judge Froelich, from whose lips I first heard this term, but you get to grade the papers of the trial judges, right?
Well, true.
Why don't you explain
correct
that?
any mistake, whether it's made by the trial judge, the prosecutor, the ineffective defense lawyer, in a civil matter, an error in terms of admissibility of evidence or handling a motion. We correct the mistakes made by attorneys, judges, and juries.
Okay. Judge Froelich.
And sometimes, well, administrative bodies, but of course they would go to common pleas court first before we would see them.
Okay. But you graded their papers. That's right.
Well,
so to speak.
that's Judge Froelich's terminology.
Yes, that's right.
But
That's
any trial judge,
That's right.
good or bad, mediocre, any trial judge, even the best, is reversed. Nobody's perfect.
Sure. Oh, no.
And we're not, I mean, obviously,
I
we're not
understand
perfect
that.
on the Court of Appeals. We don't always agree.
Yeah.
And some of the time, when we don't agree, those cases are the ones that the Ohio Supreme Court takes a look at.
Okay. So we have about 10 minutes left in the show. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the cases that you've had that are over in your tenure on the Court of Appeals? Obviously, well, obvious to me, I'm an attorney, but maybe not so obvious to the general public, but you hear appeals in both civil and criminal matters.
Civil, criminal, domestic relations, probate, juvenile.
Okay. Do you want to talk about any aspects of hearing that? Maybe how do you hear the cases? You don't hear them yourself. You sit on a panel. Why don't you talk a little bit about the process?
Well, as a trial judge, it's one judge. If you appear
Right.
for jury duty, there's one judge presiding, unless, of course, it could be a, I don't know, let me take that back. There are 3 judge panels in death penalty cases, but that would be just a 3-judge panel.
Right. But on the Court of Appeals.
On the Court of Appeals, we sit in panels of 3.
Mm-hmm.
There are 5 of us on the Court of Appeals. The current judges on our court are Judge Ron Lewis, who's from Greene County, Judge Jeff Wellbaum, who's from Miami County, Judge Mike Tucker, who I serve with on Common Pleas Court bench in Montgomery County, and one of our newer judges, Judge Chris Epley.
Okay. And when a case comes in, we don't have to get down in the weeds about this, but when a case comes in, you are assigned to a panel to evaluate that case and conduct a hearing if you're going to have a hearing.
Right. Oral argument occurs at the request of counsel. Not every case is argued.
Right.
Some are submitted without argument. So unlike the trial bench, we don't have an array of people in front of us, probation officers, defendants, complaining witnesses, plaintiff's counsel. We simply have 2 attorneys, if we have oral argument, that are arguing based upon the briefs they've submitted. So we do a lot of reading and writing. We have a lot more time to ponder about the law than a trial judge. So it offers us an opportunity for quiet reflection, to ferret out if a mistake was made, and we can debate that for hours, whereas the lower court may have only had a few minutes to make a determination because there were 12 jurors or 8 jurors in a civil case waiting to move on the case.
So maybe even backing up a little. So you are in a court of appeals. So for a case to come before you, there has to have been some matter that was
A
before
final
the trial.
appealable order, a
Before
final
the
judgment.
trial, yes. I'm trying to break this down for someone, the lay person watching this. And so the matter has been resolved, at least temporarily, at the trial level. And one or sometimes both parties will appeal
Correct.
whatever decision it is that is in dispute. And then it will be assigned to one of the panels in the Court of Appeals, and you will review the record of the lower court.
Correct.
And then based upon that review and briefs that are submitted by the attorneys who are handling the appeals, and also based upon whether there's an oral hearing where the judges get an opportunity to question those attorneys over the issues that they've submitted for appeal. Then and only then, after all that is done, do you then sit down and decide the case, but you've already had the opportunity to review transcripts.
Correct.
And but the key for most people to understand is, at that point, somebody may be seeking a retrial, but you're not retrying the facts of the case, unless I don't want to get too deep into de novo and matters and so forth. But you're basically looking at the case from below and deciding whether those results should be affirmed, or they should stand as they are.
Or reversed.
Or reversed in whole or in part. Is that
Correct. That's a fair assessment.
is that
Yes.
is that a Is that, okay. So are there, now that I've sort of laid the groundwork here, if you want to call it that, what can happen along the way before you ultimately issue a decision?
I'm not sure I understand.
Well,
You'll have to clarify that question.
Well, you might have oral argument, you might not.
Right,
the
that's,
case may-
counsel has to request oral
Okay.
argument.
And so in oral argument, what happens?
Oh, any one of the panel can ask questions of counsel. Each attorney's given 15 minutes to present their argument. We've already read their briefs. We're already familiar with the record. So that 15 minutes, they present their case, and we have the opportunity to ask them questions.
Okay. And then ultimately,
We
you'll-
advise them after the 15 minutes, each side 30 minutes, that we're taking the matter under advisement, and we'll render a decision in due course as promptly as humanly possible, but you want to give it the time it deserves. And every case is different. Some are more complex than others.
Okay.
Some we might get out an opinion in a couple weeks, others may take several months.
Now, as I am reminded here by the folks here at the station that we have less than 5 minutes left in the show, I'd like to finish that a little bit on the one hand, but I think more importantly, I'd like to hear any final reflections you might have on your career as a judge. 5 minutes is not enough, or 4 minutes, but I ask you to take some time before today and think about this. And we had another forum in which I interviewed you recently, so we've talked about this a little. You have any thoughts or comments that you want to share as you kind of head down and out the door, so to speak, of all these wonderful years as a lawyer and as a judge, although hopefully you'll be sitting by assignment in cases around the state, but about your years as a judge, certain reflections you might have.
Well, 5 minutes is more than enough time.
Okay, okay.
The best advice I had when I campaigned the first time from my brother was to be pithy, to not
Okay.
talk too much.
Okay.
Law is a wonderful career, a wonderful vocation. Not everybody's suited to it, but I love to work with young people. I've always prided myself on the number of interns, externs that I've helped along the way, not just when I was a trial judge or appellate judge, but even when I was a practitioner. I love working with young people, and I would never discourage anybody from going to law school. It's a wonderful career. You can do so many different things. You can work for the government, you can work in private sector, you can work for a firm, you can go into a corporation, and there's any number of things you can do with a law degree. I think it's just a great vocation.
Okay.
And I've been very blessed. I've had wonderful mentors along the way,
Okay.
great colleagues and friends. I've encountered many, many fine lawyers in my career.
Okay. Any advice for young lawyers today in terms of how they might relate to one another or communicate, or the necessity for civility and professionalism?
That's where we start. Civility, your reputation is everything. There's a phrase I like: reputation is what men and women think of us, character, what God and angels know of us. But your reputation, your character, your behavior becomes known to other people in the legal community, your fellow lawyers, the attorney on the other side, the judiciary, your clients. So the important thing is to be civil, to be honest, because your reputation is everything, absolutely everything.
Conversely, the loss of that reputation is hard to get back, isn't it?
It's really impossible to get back.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, you're beating the 5-minute rule. You want to talk about?
Well, I hope when I
anything else?
retire, I might get to try a case with my middle niece. I have 5 nieces and nephews that are
Okay.
attorneys, and one does. In fact, her husband actually right now is defending one of the 9/11 terrorists. Some of those cases are still pending. Some of those individuals, as the public probably know, are in Guantanamo. So They do very high-profile work, but I would like to try a murder case with her. There's one pending in West Virginia that I might get to try with her. But I also want to be a visiting judge, and you can't do both, so I have to figure out the sequencing of all that.
Okay, okay. Well, an evening with Judge Mary Donovan from Public Defender to the Court of Appeals. There's so many more questions I have, I guess, part based upon our friendship all these years, from being my first partner in the Public Defender's office and taking care of one of our children while my wife was in labor with our second child. And I just thank you for everything, being my friend, and for all of your great public service for this community. And I wish you only the best in the future.
Thank you. Likewise, Jeff.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and good night.